right. Okay, good morning. This is episode 7 of Brave Indigenous Conversations with Joan Jack. And as you can see on the screen, I've learned something new. We have our guest here, but I'm going to do the opening that that's evolving. A couple of weeks ago, or maybe 3 weeks ago, I heard this piece of writing, and it really impacted me. So I'm gonna read it. It's called An Invitation to a Brave Space. Together, we will create brave space because there is no such thing as a safe space. We exist in the real world. We all carry scars, and we have all caused wounds. In this space, we seek to turn down the volume of the outside world. We amplify voices that fight to be heard elsewhere. We call each other to more truth and love. We have the right to start somewhere and continue to grow. We have the responsibility to examine what we think we know. We will not be perfect. It will not always be what we wish it to be, but it will be our brave space, and we will work on it side by side. That was written by Mickey Scott B. Jones, and I was deeply impacted, so I'm going to continue to share it until I don't feel like sharing it. So before I invite our guest to introduce himself, I just wanted to, for the new listeners, welcome. And for a couple of my loyal lifetime friends that are listening and standing by and supporting me, I just was reflecting this morning on how everything is teamwork. Everything is teamwork. So I just want to thank those people who are supporting me. And for those of you that are new, I created Brave Indigenous Conversations with Joan Jack because as loud as I am and as outspoken as I am, I still felt stifled. And I'm not the kind of person that can make a speech. Like I could make a speech, but I don't enjoy it. What I enjoy is visiting because that's our culture. So I thought, well, why not invite? I know so many people. I'm sure I can get people to visit with me. So on that note, I'd like you to introduce yourself, Chief.
Sure. Miigwech Joan. Nibin Makwa Indijnikas Makwan Totem. I just introduced myself in my language, Anishinaabemowin. I'm known as Summer Bear. I'm from the Bear clan, but I'm also Derek Nepinak. And I'm the chief of the Minnegozibi Anishinaabe. We're about 4,500 Anishinaabe people living on the west shore of Lake Winnipegosis in what everyone now calls West Central Manitoba. Is that enough introduction, or should I go a little bit further? Because I can.
It's our time together. Yeah. Do you mind if I call you Derek? I know you
sure,
don't. Sure,
absolutely. Of course.
I know you don't mind.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, say what's in your heart.
Sure. Yeah. I'm first of all, I'm honored to be requested to be on your show, Joan. I know that you have a very strong voice and you have a lot of people that tune into your messaging. So I'm happy to participate and contribute if I can in a positive way to those messages that need to be shared. I've been back home now for a couple of years. We're in a 4-year term cycle in Minnegozibi. We also were called Pine Creek. For the longest time, we were called Pine Creek First Nation, and before that, we were just the Pine Creek Indian Band. And as we try to reclaim our language and reclaim our culture and space and our land, we go back to the Minnegozibi Anishinaabe, which is incorporating our language into our identity, which is, I think, very important for us. So before that,
can I interrupt you? Can you tell people what Minnegozibi means?
Sure. Minego would be like the pine tree. Is my understanding that's what that would be. It's like a compressed word, so we say Minego, but it's actually Mineego. Wow. So it's the way I understood it, pine tree. And of course, Zibing means moving water, so a creek or a river. So Pine Creek. So it's almost a literal translation. And of course, Anishinaabe, we know what Anishinaabe means.
Human being.
Yeah.
As opposed to Makwa, which is bear.
Yeah. So before this, I was doing private contracting work in the communities, working in Saskatchewan and Manitoba. And of course, I was the Grand Chief at the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs from 2011 to 2017. So I did 2 terms there, and then before that, I was chief in my community. It's where I started out in the leadership space. In Indian government back home. Back then, we called ourselves Pine Creek First Nation, and I started that as fresh out of law school. Almost, I was doing my master's degree in Winnipeg, and I finished law school the year before, and then the aunties back home asked me to think about leadership. They said you'd be a good chief here, so I said okay if you want to put my name in. I never really thought I had a chance at beating the incumbent, because I'd been away for a lot of years from back home, and but nonetheless I won. I won the election, and that's kind of what put me into this pathway. I think for the longest time before that, I was being prepared for something. When you're in school, you're wondering, where am I going to be? Where am I going? And I think
Yeah.
I'm there. Wherever I was supposed to be, wherever I was going, I think I'm there now. So I'm satisfied. I do the best I can with what I know.
Awesome. I think it's great that you're at somebody. I mean, everybody who steps up for leadership is valuable and important. It's not an easy job, that's for sure. And you may as well just say, "Shoot me here." There's like a big target on your chest when you get elected to chief and council. So I really honor that and recognize that in our leadership, which is not to say that I'm not one of the critics. I mean, I think there's a need for full discourse and all of this personal defensiveness that leaders have in our communities I'm tired of that already. Anyways, I digress.
No,
Um,
that's an important point, Joan. I
okay,
think I
go
think I think I think what you're identifying is that leadership means that you're going to be criticized, and
ahead.
you have to be open to criticism,
Uh,
because I've seen, and in my own work, criticism keeps you sharp. You know, um, we don't know everything coming into these roles in leadership, whether you're on council or whether you're a chief, and people are going to call you out on on what they believe to be or perceive to be some of your weaknesses and strengths, and that's okay. You have to be okay with that, and you have to be comfortable, knowing that you don't know everything, and that there's going to be challenges, and there's going to be difficulty. And I see a lot of leadership taking things personally, and that's why you see the defensive response from so many, because it can be scary at times. Even the strongest leaders are scared at times, because they feel, did we do something wrong? Did we misstep? How do we fix it? And there's vulnerability in that, and you have to be willing to be vulnerable in leadership if you're gonna learn from it, and if you're gonna grow from it. So your point is very well taken. I appreciate that.
Can you share a little bit with the listeners? Like, I mean, it's kind of personal, but I mean, it's helpful too, though. Like, so at the beginning, I'm sure you didn't have the skill set to like not be so hurt and wounded. I know I didn't. Like, as an unofficial leader, I have a lot of people sharing their opinion with me about me all the time. And at first, I was wounded. I was like wounded. So what have you done? What have you done to avoid that wounding?
Well, I think my very first day as a chief back in 2008, I brought in like a 3 or 4 page written speech for the council and for the members that came into the meeting. And I remember being so nervous and so uncertain. I started my day. I remember this very clearly. I went outside as the sun was coming up and offered tobacco. And I said, please, Creator, give me the strength to do this the right way. And I went into that meeting. I read my speech, shaking, the papers just shaking in my hands, and the kind hearts of our people just watched and they listened. And what I did was I really leaned on what I thought and what I knew to be previous leadership, because part of my council included, previous chief, the late Clifford McKay back home. He was our chief for a long time. So I was leaning on people I knew had leadership experience, but I was also very heavily reliant on my own ego, Joan, because here I was a law graduate. I did a first class honors BA at the University of Alberta in Native Studies, graduated from law school, went to Osgoode Hall, did the intensive program in Aboriginal lands, resources, and governance. And I was doing my master's degree in Indigenous governance. So you know what, Joan, I knew everything. I knew everything.
Thank God.
And when you ground yourself in Western education, you feel you've got the solution. So there's a little bit of security in that, but it's a false security.
Ah,
It's a false security. It's good to have that, but your tool belt of skills has to include, you have to know who your people are. You have to know who you are. You have to know the customs, cultures, and the ways of your people. You have to know who the families are. You have to know how people like to interact, just like we are right now. You have to be willing to go and sit at somebody's table and be criticized. These things took time for me to grow into, and it required me to almost shed my skin, to recognize that, I went to law school. I think I'm smart, but I don't know anything. I don't know anything, and it was experience that I gained during that time that helped me recognize, there's far more to leadership than your degrees after your name or the letters after your name. You have to bring humanity into the space, and
oh,
in order for me to get there, like I said, I had to strip away a lot of what I thought was going to be good leadership, and that meant humbling myself to the reality and the truth of what we're experiencing as colonized people.
yeah.
I relied on my elders. I went to their sweats. I received my pipe bundles, my drums. My drums came along during that time. I struggled, and I took everything personally because
Mhm.
I expected people to appreciate me. But the truth is, in leadership, you have to be willing to do your work without being appreciated. So
Amen to that.
I carried that. I carried that pain of not being appreciated, and I'm like, well, I just did this for our community. Doesn't anybody appreciate that? And I think some people did, but you have to be willing to do it selflessly.
Uh,
It's not about getting a pat on the back for everything you do. You got to be willing to just do the work and then to move on to the next day and do the next piece of work. And in my mind, I don't know if I was ready for that. I thought I was owed something, I think, back then, and
mm,
I burned out. I burned out in that cycle, in that process, and then I went to the AMC and I thought, well, maybe my skills are going to be better utilized here. And I continued to grow, continued to get knocked down, and stand back up. And there was lots of highs and lows during that time as well. During that time, I went to Sundance, and that to me was a very significant, pivotal point in my reclamation of humanity in my own world and in my own life. I had to strip away what I thought was this important leader, and I
mm,
reemerged as myself, and
mm,
always working to find comfort in who I am as a person, who I am as a dad, who I am as a partner, and just trying to live day to day and do what I can the best way I
mm,
can. And that to me is how I was forged into what I am now. And
oh,
the learning will never stop. The learning is always going to be there.
yeah.
Um, I'm always going to be knocked down, but I'm always going to get back up and dust myself off and go back to the office and continue to do what I believe is going to be the way forward for us. So
Mm.
that's how I work now.
Awesome. So I want to share two things that were awoken in me when you were sharing. My mom is a big part of my life. I mean, she dedicated 20 years of her life, to Brian and I to look after our children. When they were young, the three of us, we were like a three-legged stool, and mom started with me in that role. When I began law school, I said, well, I don't know, if you come with me, I'll go, and so
Mhm.
I didn't really want to go to law school, but so she said, I'll come. Like, my mom is super curious and adventurous and strong and brave and free, amazing woman. And so one time after coming back into community life, like the process you've described is for those of us that go and get an education, because our communities say, people say, go to school, get an education, get an education. And then most cases, I don't know about your community, but most cases, people come home and then they can't get the jobs. The jobs, all white people have the jobs mostly. And so there's like some kind of a rub going on there. But anyways, I was in that process of sort of reuniting, it's like a being reabsorbed back into community after having been in that institutional space. And my mom said to me, she was watching me, and I said, what? And she said, I'm so glad I never went to university. I said, why? And she said, because I'm watching you struggle to reprogram your brain. And I don't have to do that. Like, I'm right here and I'm like, oh my God, like that's what you're talking about, how it's all with the best intentions. We go to school and we try to get things to help the people. And then, the whole thing when you get home, it's like, what do you mean you don't want to do what I'm talking about? Like, don't you see what I see?
Mhm.
And it's like, no, I need a new door at my house because we're cold. That's where I am.
Mhm.
Not to belittle that at all. It's just that in the communities, the issues are so, so different. And then,
Absolutely.
yeah, I wanted to also say that I was struck when I thought I was owed something. What
Mhm.
did you mean? What did you mean when you said that?
Well, I think I think oftentimes we live our lives. Um, like I invested heavily in education, just like you did, Joan. Like I was in school for 11 years. I think it was
Yeah.
my undergrad. I took I think 5 or 6 years to do my undergrad because I did a lot of it part time, and then my law degree another 3 years after that, and then my master's degree, which I started, was that's another year. So I forewent earning income during my early 20s right through to my early 30s, sacrificing earning income to be in school, to be in classrooms, lecture halls, receiving this knowledge and accepting this knowledge. So I felt there was a trade-off. I'm going to forego income so I can have some knowledge, and then
Mm,
when I go out into the world, people owe me because I'm smart now. Like I think that's part of how some of us think coming out of that institutional setting of Western education. Like I'm owed
yeah.
some money now. I'm owed something. I'm owed the pats on the back. I'm owed a good income.
Right.
And like I think that's one of the big challenges that we carry when we come out of that Western education, is that it's almost like a sense of entitlement because I've
Mm,
done this. I'm now you now owe me something. But you have to let go of that, because really, to be in the service of the community is a great responsibility, and it's a privilege.
absolutely.
And nobody owes anybody anything. It doesn't matter. You could be in school for 20 years. Nobody owes you anything when you come out. You know,
Yeah.
uh, your community doesn't owe you anything. Nobody owes you anything. You know,
Mm-mm.
and that took some time for me to grow into that understanding,
Mm.
and I'm there now. Like nobody owes me anything, and that's how I do my work as well, on a broader scale, and how I
Mm.
interpret treaty. We spend so much time talking about treaty and who owes us this and who owes us that, and the crown owes us this and the crown did. A lot of that history is very true, and we have a lot of good reason to be mistrusting of institutions, colonial institutions, and the way treaty has not been implemented. But at the end of the day, nobody owes anybody anything. We've got to forge our own pathway into the future together. We have to understand who we are. We have to understand the nature of our relationships with colonial governments, whether they're provincial or federal, or municipal or city governments, and we have to shape our approach based on that, with the understanding that nobody's going to give us anything for free. Nobody owes us
No.
anything.
No.
We've got to earn our way through respect and balance in how we interact with one another at an individual level and an institutional level.
Yeah.
So that's
On
kind of what I meant by that.
Awesome. Well, I got it. I got it completely. I totally get it. For a long time, I had a similar feeling that, I wasn't appreciated, I wasn't valued, and we could talk about so many things, but we only have a limited time. We have about a half hour left. And I'm
Okay.
really interested, or a bit more, whatever. I'm really interested in the work you're doing right now around health. So if you wouldn't mind doing, this is an active service for all of us,
Sure.
Derek, like start at the beginning, like as if you're talking to some white person who has no understanding of anything about us. They just think we get everything free. Start
Mhm.
by talking to that guy.
Sure. Well, generations ago, our ancestors went into ceremony, and that ceremony led to the opportunity for new relationships to emerge with people that were coming from all over the world, and a lot of people that were coming to our lands were fleeing violence. because some of these cultures were based in violence, and the acquisition of space and the acquisition of wealth, as it was understood, was through violent acts upon one another. So many people came here, and we got to a point where treaties could be made. And when we went into treaty, we believe in a concept. It's almost like a philosophy. My elder Harry Bone, he calls it agoidanan, Anishinaabe agoidanan. It means that we have what we had before treaty, but then we have more, because there's a new relationship. So there's additionality after treaty. They didn't take anything away with treaty creation. They didn't create rights as they're currently being interpreted in Canadian law, because all our rights were there already. They were inherent rights. And what we talked about in treaty was the opportunity for shaping new relationships. And I'm constantly reminded every day, Joan, about treaty, because here in my home office, I have this treaty medal, and I have another treaty medal hanging on the wall, and I have my bundle here. I have my headdress. I have my medicines here, so I'm never allowed to forget about who I am as a treaty person. Fast forward to the late 1960s, and you've got a Canadian government who's forgotten that it has responsibilities to treaty and to treaty people. They introduce a white paper. Our chiefs at the time, including my late ancestor Daniel Nepinak, signed what's called in Manitoba Wabung. It was the document of the Manitoba Indian Brotherhood at the time. And that document talked about the need for Canada to create its own health legislation, respecting Indigenous people. Now, these were strong treaty leaders at the time, and they remembered treaty because it was still very strong in the oral tradition, still very strong in the language. And they talked about the need for better health services for Indigenous people as an outcome of our colonization. There's so much illness that we carry in our bodies, so much trauma that manifests into diabetes, and other chronic illnesses that oftentimes goes undiagnosed. They knew that already in the 1960s, early 1970s. So they said, Canada, you need to provide better quality services in health to us as Indigenous people, because we have a treaty right to health. So they said, if it has to be legislation, it should be legislation. And that's right in the Wabung document, which was our pushback to the 1969 white paper, right? So I look back on that time and I thought, why would the chiefs back then ask for health legislation when they were such strong treaty-based leaders at the time? And what I began to think about was some of the teachings I had received from some of my elders who, some of who have already gone, to the other side. And I was reminded by the late Francis Nepinak. He told me one time, he said, our laws are the same, but they're the opposite. and that's such a profound statement, because that could be interpreted in so many different ways. But the more I thought about it, I thought, well, the introduction of health legislation in Canada for Indigenous people is not about applying law on us. It's about holding Canadian citizens to a standard of human rights that's not there today.
Boom.
Because right now, health services in Canada for Indigenous people is entirely policy based. Nobody feels that they have a responsibility to provide adequate and equitable health services to Indigenous people, not the provinces, not the federal government, because we're what's called that jurisdictional football, that hot potato. Nobody wants to hold that hot potato and take responsibility for that relationship. So for 150 years, we've been stuck in this policy space where one government strips away all the funding and provides very minimal services. We push back, the pendulum swings the other way, and then there's a government in place where all of a sudden they want to fund health services. They want to do health reform. They want to bring new enhanced abilities for us to participate and receive the proper and adequate health services, similar in line to the treaty right to health. And then the pendulum swings the other way and we're back at square one again. In 2006, the prime minister of the day, Paul Martin, met with Phil Fontaine and the AFN, and they hammered out what everyone called the Kelowna Accord. And in there was a lot of money set aside for health reform, including the possibility that maybe health legislation and new regulations might take shape. And I'm not talking just about establishing a health authority. under the
Yeah.
Canada Health Act. I'm talking about something separate and apart where there's guaranteed statutory funding. There's new health minimums in place that can be guaranteed, by Canadian law. To the standard of human rights, which currently aren't there today, because we still have people dying in hospital waiting rooms and on hospital
Yeah.
beds and emergency rooms, being misdiagnosed and sent home to die. It's still very prevalent, So in '06, that opportunity came around. We called it Kelowna, right? Kelowna died on the floor when Stephen Harper's government came into power. And some of the concepts from Kelowna once again reemerged with the Liberals taking power in 2016. When the Liberals came into power in 2016 under Trudeau, they introduced some new money to reestablish, treaty working tables and to start talking about what treaty is again. And we've leveraged that opportunity, and I know in Manitoba, as early as 2011, we were talking about Indigenous health reform, and the need for Indigenous health law, because I had taken that from the 1960s, the leadership of that time, and I had decided that I would build my platform as a Manitoba chief around that concept. And so it reemerged. I've been involved in the conversation under federal Indigenous health legislation for the last 3 years or 2 years since I've been a chief again. I've been sitting at the technical table. I've been moving the resolutions through the process, through the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, and then through the Assembly of First Nations, to try to bring us into a space where we can actually at least have a conversation about it, not be afraid of what reform looks like.
Well, where is the resistance? Is there resistance to moving forward with legislative solutions? And then another question would be, where would the legislation be out of? Is it out of Section 35? Is it out of 9124? Is it out of 92? These are all constitutional sections. Like, where is it proposed that this legislation will flow out of? That should have been my first question. And anyway, go ahead.
It's that question is I think premised on having a bit of a background or understanding of Indigenous law and the constitutional framework.
Yeah.
And I'll answer it this way. Indigenous Services Canada has the mandate for Indigenous health legislation. We have asked, why not Crown Indigenous Relations? The minister, Mark Miller, is the Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations. And part of his mandate is treaty implementation. So if we're talking about health, we as Indigenous people are going to talk about the treaty right to health. Why is this mandate not in what's called CIRNAC, Crown Indigenous Relations, and why is it in ISK?
Yeah.
It's because Canada doesn't know what the treaty right to health is. And it's afraid to make financial commitments and legal commitments to what they believe to be a fluid concept.
Well,
Right,
that's where the financial commitments will flow from the legal commitments. Like right now, I think I see what you're saying. Like if we right now they've got it, for those of you who aren't lawyers and who aren't up on all this stuff or whatever, they've got it. The way I would explain it to an elder in my community is under 9124, which is where they took us and took us and put us in that number there, then that number is there for them to point at, to look after us. Because when they took our land, whether it's by agreement and sacred agreement and all that, in effect, in the Canadian law, our land ended up in Section 92, which is where the provinces have say so. And so they put us under the federal government for say so, and they took our land and our children and our education and a whole bunch of other things. So what you're talking about, Derek, is that now they've split that 9124 into two departments, like one that's kind of dealing with more important things, that I don't really know what the hell they're doing. And then the other one is just business as usual. So what I hear you saying is, why do we have this important treaty discussion, which would actually end up should flow out of 35? So I'm open to creating some space in my heart and mind that having it in Indigenous Crown Relations would at least create the potential to move it over to 35, because 35 is the only place that a sovereignist will go, if they will even go anywhere.
Absolutely. No, you're exactly right. In my perspective, Joan, you're exactly bang on. They captured us, eh? Colonial law has captured Indigenous people. what we call First Nations in Section 9124. Under Section 9124, they created the Indian Act. And in the Indian Act under Section 6, they legally determine who an Indian is. So they decide, even still today, you're right. Today in Ottawa, they're deciding who an Indian is and who isn't. Right so now. We're a captured identity, under 9124, under the Indian Act. And that's where this conversation is happening. The health conversation is happening within that space. Because Cernak is not.
I'd just like to add, so I want to acknowledge and recognize your bravery for going inside that space, because that space is so offensive. I mean, so offensive. And you more than anybody would know that with your educational background, both in ceremony and in the white law and white culture, that to go in there and to have a conversation that's based on our integrity as Indigenous people in a space that isn't even created for any of that. So I just wanted to acknowledge you and thank you for going in there, because that's another reason that I'm sure a lot of people are telling you that they're not happy.
I appreciate that, Joan, because I know that, in the past work that I've done, you've been on the treaty rides with me. You know how committed, like we all have been, putting our own physical well-being and health on the line so that we could carry the treaty message in the hopes that a future generation of our people, our children, our grandchildren will know what it's like to be a treaty Indian in today's Canadian colonial infrastructure. So it's always been there. But, I've also seen, as I said before, our people dying in the emergency rooms waiting to see a doctor. I've seen chronic illness overtake entire families. I've seen an epidemic of diabetes. I myself, I'm struggling with diabetes now. So I have to do what I can to try to stay healthy for as long as I can. We're stuck in that space, So we have to do something. We can't stand still anymore. We can't stand still waiting for someone who owes us something. Yeah. We have to be willing to shift and look for what's the best available options today.
So in the visual, you go, so 9124 is where we're captured legally in this country. And then they've split 9124 into these two departments. Goodness knows why. I think it personally have some nasty things to say about why that split is there. But, in where they're having this discussion about our health is basically what I tell white people is, we don't really get anything extra that any other poor Canadian gets. Like the ridiculous insurance that we have as Canadians in general, whether you're on welfare or you're a registered Indian, it's the same plan, basically. It covers the bare minimum. Nothing, you can't have any brand name medication. You can't, we're trapped in this space, a social space, a social net space where we're seen, even though we are the Indigenous people, and this is our damn land. We didn't come from Japan. We came from right here. So this is our land. And so we're trapped in this space where we're considered a social problem.
Yes.
So what you're trying to do is take, at least within the 9124, take that discussion from that social poverty space, into at least a treaty relations space that ultimately would end up in legislation, I hope, flowing out of 35, that recognize that treaty nation to nation. Look at my nails are dirty. I'm in the bush. Too funny. Anyway, I'm having a big speech here, and I see this is how my God works, keeps me humble. I'm making a big speech, and then I see my dirty nails. But even some people still won't agree. Some of our people still won't agree that legislation flowing out of 35, like I know, God bless her, Jody Wilson-Raybould, I totally admire her and have read everything she's written, and she's amazing. And people in BC talk about it in terms of recognition legislation, and a sovereigntist would say, same shit, different pile. Sorry, I'm not a part of Canada. And so it's a progression, I think. And I think that's where you're going. Right?
I think, when we look at recognition legislation, for example, just to take that for a moment,
Yep.
C92, an act respecting Indigenous children, families, that's partly recognition legislation, because what it does is it recognizes that Indigenous people have an inherent right to raise their own children and their own families in the way and shape and form that they so choose. And in exercising that right, they have the ability to reclaim their law and to apply it, and within the paramountcy of law, that Indigenous law has paramountcy, or it will apply ahead of provincial law. That's something that's there within C92. So it is recognition, but it also has a practical
Derek, I'm
piece.
sorry, I'm running my internet through Starlink and a generator, and
Sure.
there was a little bit of a wiggle in your, so you cut out at paramountcy.
Yeah.
Explain paramountcy to people who are listening. If they're not lawyers, they won't understand.
I guess in paramountcy is a constitutional law concept in terms of which law applies,
Yeah,
within the constitutional framework. And for the longest time, colonial Canada had no space whatsoever for the
yeah,
existence or the idea that Indigenous people had laws.
yeah.
Okay, so when C92 came out, what it did was it allowed for an express recognition that there's an inherent right to self-government when it comes to children and families that stays with Indigenous people. That's, I think, the first piece of legislation that we've seen that recognizes that. So from there, within the inherent right, we have the space to reclaim law. So we as Anishinaabe people, we spend the time sitting around the table talking about what did we do before treaty? How did we raise our children? How did we make sure that they were safe and protected? How did we take care of families? So we articulate that, we put it down on paper. And we're not creating new law, Joan, in
No, no.
C92. We're reclaiming and remembering our law. And
Mm.
that's
And
kind of.
how is legally in the framework, how is Canada, the justice, making space for that? Like in that, I really haven't looked at C92. I'm just so busy in the bush doing what I'm doing. I haven't really looked at any of this. And I think most Indigenous people haven't looked at any of this. So this is valuable. Like in once that conversation happens in our communities, and we're being funded to have those conversations right now. And once those conversations are concluded, where we remember and recognize again who we are as Indigenous people within our own legal paradigm, then what? Where does it go legally?
I think what we're seeing is that process in motion right now. And let me premise what I'm going to say, Joan, on the fact that I recognize you as already living our law. You're a living example of Anishinaabe law in action. And anyone that knows you knows the lifetime of commitment that you've made to taking care of family, to raising young people in a healthy way, being a good partner, being loyal and dedicated to the land, working with, smoking fish. That's why your fingers are all, your fingernails are dirty, because you're engaged with the land in that relationship that can never be broken. That's the law, Joan, right?
It is the law.
The rest of us are sitting around a table writing stuff down.
I want you to. I want you to. Like the old people say, write it down for me. Write it down.
Yeah. So C92, the act would identify that there's recognition. Canadian colonial institutions recognize Indigenous law, and then they say this is what the framework can look like. We want these minimum standards. We want the Canadian Charter to apply. Okay, your law will take precedent over provincial laws. This is a standard in terms of best interest of the child. Your law will establish programs and services. So there's an interlocking. It's almost like a hybridization opportunity of who we are plugging into who they are. And at the end of the day, having a system in place that respects families, respects children, and respects who we are as Indigenous people with inherent rights. And the process is playing out, but there's a lot of political actors and a lot of challenges that are in the way.
So many. And how would that be operationalized though? Like, is it again back to my 91-24, 92-35? Where does C92 get operationalized? Like when to the woman who wants to come, we're here at the Nakana Call, and she wants to come here, with her family because she wants to reclaim her responsibility to for the food and all of that medicine picking and all that. Who helps her? How is that going to happen?
that is a very that's a practical
Yeah.
challenge or an operational challenge that brings in the conversation about how do we operate? How do we operate in Canada? Canada operates on Canadian currency. It there's a king's treasury, right? And that currency is what operationalizes a lot of the agreements that we make in law or in regulation. Like
Mm,
right now in Canada, every First Nation has access to First Nations Child and Family Service dollars.
mm,
Those dollars are flowing after the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal decision with Cindy Blackstock and the AFN negotiating, I think it was $43 billion.
yeah.
Some of that money is already in circulation and it's making its way to the First Nations communities to support families. Exactly like you said, Joan. If there's a mom and her kids or a mom and a dad and their kids and they want to go out to Nakina
Not gonna call. Yeah.
to where you're at to learn how to reattach to the land, to learn effective parenting, the community has the funding to support that.
Mm,
It's called prevention funding.
mm,
And the idea is that communities will build their own capacity in program and service development so that kids can stay home and they can stay home. And
mhm,
moms and dads can stop feeling ashamed about the challenges they face in a
mhm,
colonized world and get the
mhm,
supports they need to be effective parents and
mhm.
effective community members. There's funding there. My own community, for example, Pine Creek, Minnegozi B, we have, I think our budget this year is close to 1.8 million to spend on the development of services to help families reconnect.
Yeah.
It's called prevention funding,
Yeah.
and every community has that. We just have to be willing to spend it and utilize it in the best way possible.
Yeah.
But we're afraid to spend because we get called out on it if we're spending money in the
Yeah.
community still.
Yeah. And then I think there's a whole level. I mean, it's almost 1:45, and I like to keep to the hour. I mean, an hour is a long time. I mean, I'm sure people are going to listen to this podcast because you're amazing. Anyway, and I'm a fan. Um, I have to tell a funny story. So one time you and I were on a bike run, and Brian, I love my husband he's my soulmate, and yeah, I just could
Mhm.
weep if I think about not being with him. Like I just anyway, so I take off. I'm riding my Harley with Derek somewhere and following him, and I insist on being the second one in the run. And I know that's caused you trouble with other men who want to ride behind the big chief. And I'm like, no, get to the fucking back because I'm riding second because I'm riding for women and I'm riding for
Mhm.
the people and the families. And they're all like, hate that bitch, whatever. So there I am behind Derek. So we're on the news, and I call home, and Brian says, "How are you doing, honey?" I'm like, "I'm good, sore, a little bit sore, whatever." Eh? He said, "You TV today with all that leather on." And then I said to him, he said, "You better not run off with one of those bikers." And I said, "Brian, not ever. They don't even have land like yours." I didn't even know
Yeah.
why that segued in here, but I was conscious of the time, and I wanted to, and we've really cut off a big discussion there. I mean, we could talk so much more. There's so many things, but I wanted to spend a little of the time too for you to express yourself around why do you ride,
Mm,
because that's
okay.
important in 2000, what do you call this century, the 20,000s? I don't even know how to say it, the 60s,
20,
the 70s,
21st,
the
21st
21st.
century.
Oh, okay. Thank you for
Yeah.
orienting me to the century I'm actually in. So
Yeah.
why have you chosen to do that as an Indigenous leader, of some, people know who you are?
Well, I think going back to when I was a boy, and I was on a little motorcycle on a little dirt bike, and I remember zipping around on the hills and the gravel and then wiping out. And when I woke up, I was looking up at the sky. I'm like, what just happened? And I realized I'd wiped out on my bike and maybe I was knocked out for a second or something. But I remember, and I had a fear about that for a long time. After that, I was a little bit fearful of loud sounding engines and so when I got a little bit older, I'm like, I need to overcome these things. I need to be comfortable and I need to express myself because I I don't like to live in fear.
Mm,
Like even my law degree, for example, I could have went to the same school that I did my undergraduate degree in. I knew the campus, I knew everybody, I knew the teachers, and I was comfortable there. I'm someone who always moves myself into uncomfortable spaces to
Ah,
expand the scope of my experience. That's who I am.
yeah.
So going back to the motorcycles, I needed to deal with that, and I needed to feel free. Like um, I I'm a type of person who, like, I have my home, I have my home base, my home community, but I feel I'm part of such a bigger human and geographical experience that I don't want to miss it. I don't want to miss a moment of life. So I
Mm,
want to I want to be out there. I want to smell the air.
mm,
I want to traverse across the land. And
mm,
I think maybe in a past life, maybe I was on horseback a lot. Like maybe I rode horses all over the place. I don't know, but in this lifetime it felt very important for me to get back on the bike. You get
mm,
kicked off the horse, get back on. So get back on the bike and become comfortable and
mm,
be okay being connected that way. And part of it too is, I'll be quite honest, it's an affirmation of my faith in the Creator that He's going to take care of me.
mm.
And you've been there, Joan. I've ridden through torrential rains in Ontario behind semi trucks at night.
Yes.
I've done it without fear because
Mm,
I believe that we've been protected in what we're doing,
mm,
because we're
mm,
reclaiming space, we're
mm.
carrying an important message, and that feeds into the Wounded Knee ride, which I do. Just like Chief Clarence Louis and Bernie Shepherd and other leaders from our community have been doing that ride since the beginning, and I picked up on it. I think 2015 was our first year
Mhm,
and you were there as well.
mhm,
It's part of expressing who we are,
mm.
not being in agreement to be confined to the borders of our
Boom,
reserve, to say
boom.
we're here, we're present, we're all over the place, and we've always been all over the place, and we're going to continue to be everywhere, because that's who we are. This is our homeland, and we're not going to be denied access to the beautiful places in our territory. So when I go down to Wounded Knee on my bike each year, and I'm going again this year, it's a long ride. It's plus 35 to 40 degrees Celsius. We stop in the middle of open fields where there's no trees to shade us from the heat, and what we do is we bring respect and honor to the interconnectedness of our nations, because
Yes.
we all share a common trauma, and that is the imposition of colonization and colonialism in our homelands. And that imposition has been much more abrupt in some cases, like at Wounded Knee, when the United States Army, it murdered 300 unarmed men, women, and children and elders, and that trauma is still fresh in the minds of people because it's
Yeah.
within the living memory of
Yeah.
some of the elders who come out and talk about what happened at Wounded Knee. So
Yeah.
it's still very painful, because our people yearn for respectful relationships. Our people yearn for equity and equality and
Yeah.
respect in these complex social worlds we live in, and they deserve it. So I bring honor to that relationship by making sure that I make that run, uh,
Mm.
no matter how uncomfortable I am, because I'm more of a cold weather person.
Yeah.
So I'm okay if it's plus 20, but when it's plus 40 outside, like, I'm melting, and I'm
Yeah,
very,
you actually feel like you're cooking on the
yeah,
bike.
yeah,
Like, you actually and I said that to another rider one time, when I was on the MMIW run with, Charmaine Willier-Larson there, and we were in, New Mexico, and it was, like, 102 degrees, and you're flying down the highway at, 120 kilometers an hour or whatever it is, and I actually felt like I was baking,
yeah, yeah,
cooking, and then
yeah.
when we stopped at a gas station, I said that, and then this woman who lives in New Mexico, she's like, "Well, you are." I was like, "Oh my god."
Yeah, you're
That's
baking,
how
but you're slow baking. You're slow
you're
you're slow baking at 100
slow
degrees.
cooking, eh? Slow
Yeah,
cooking.
yeah.
So
So that's
it's an act of sovereign spiritual sovereignty. Hey, I just said a new
absolutely.
thing.
Yeah,
Spiritual sovereignty.
it is, and you meet new people along the way. You participate in ceremonies if you're invited to them, where you can, and it's an experience that we should not deny ourselves.
Mm,
When I was
mm,
younger, there's places I wouldn't go because I didn't feel like I was good enough to go into certain places.
yeah,
Like, and I think even today, maybe some of our young people still feel that way. You know, I can't go there because I'm not good enough for that town, or I'm not good enough for that city. And I fought to overcome that,
Yeah.
because this place is our place.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's how I feel, and that's why I ride, and I'll ride until I can't anymore.
Yeah. I'm going to share a little how I feel. I'm waiting for I feel frustrated because my friend Gord McNaught, he said to me years ago, he said he's an old white guy. He calls himself an old fat white guy. He's an amazing person, amazing person. And he said to me, Joan, he said, I think you're the only person I know that's living at least three distinct lives. And so my frustration around riding bumps up with my love to be right where I am in this moment, because I won't be at the August ride to Wounded Knee again, because I have to choose between being here with Brian and the kids and the family, even though personally I would love to be there, but I can't because I've made a commitment to this space and my family, and so that's difficult. That's really difficult personally. I don't even know why I said that, but anyways, that's where I'm at. And why do I ride? um for me, I started riding, I rode, I was about 16, I think, and I was walking on Portage Avenue in Winnipeg. There used to be a small McDonald's and a big walk-in McDonald's. I think it's some kind of Mr. Big and Tall store now, but back in the day, it used to be an indoor sit-down McDonald's restaurant, not McDonald's, A&W restaurant. And I was 16 and I was waitressing there, going to high school, and this girl came out of the little A&W and came right onto Portage Avenue and slapped me right in the face, and I fell down, and she was calling me squaw and all this stuff, and I had never had an experience like that in my life. And I was just crying, and oh my god, I was so traumatized, and she was jealous about, I don't know what she was jealous about. So then I went to the back of the A&W where I was heading to work, and I couldn't start. That's when I started smoking that day too. And that's where and so I was in the back of the staff room there, crying and crying and crying, and this guy who was hanging out in the small, black guy, he was Clarence, his name was, he was hanging out in the small A&W, and he came running after me, and he found me, and I couldn't stop crying, and he said, stop crying and I'll teach you how to ride a motorcycle. And I had never even thought about riding a motorcycle, and but I used to see the bikers, and I used to think they were so cool and so
Mhm,
tough, as victimized, misogyny, colonialism, all that stuff. I thought I needed that power, and I wanted to feel safe.
mhm,
And so when Clarence said that, he was a street racer. He had a Kawasaki, and he was a mechanic, and he used to soup up his bike. And so it was so fast. Like, he was so fast. Don't do this. I'm not recommending anybody do this. But so he taught me how to ride. And then I
yeah.
bought a bike, and he souped up my carb. And I had so many tickets at one point. I had to go in front of that board where you have to explain why you need your license. So I
Yeah,
have a love of speed. I have a love of going fast, and
yeah,
I just love it, and the freedom.
mhm,
But for those of you that love me, I don't go too fast anymore because I'm old. And my Harley, this guy scared me on another run in the States. He said, "Oh, how do you make out with the Harley wobble?" I was like, "What are you talking about?" And he said, "Oh, you haven't heard of the Harley wobble?" And I was like, "No." And he said, "Well, some bikes at a certain speed, they just start to wobble, and that's it. It's all over." And I was like, "Okay, I'm not going to go. I don't want to know about that." So
yeah,
I stick to 120. That's fast enough, whatever. The odd
mhm,
time between Fort Nelson and no, Fort Fort St. John and Fort Nelson. There's a 4-hour strip of the Alaska Highway that's beautiful. It's cooler all the time, and there's really hardly any traffic. And sometimes in that space, I open it up to maybe 130 because, I don't want the Harley wobble. Anyway, so I love the speed. I love the freedom. I love feeling powerful as a woman and in control of my own body, like 100%, just me and God. And that's the piece, the main piece is it's so spiritual. It's so
mhm,
spiritual because the only way I can face that fear is if I connect, you know,
Mm-hmm.
if I
Yep.
connect. And, you know, if you think you're dead, like it's not about, you know, ruminating about whatever memory. You're present and
Yep.
in the moment, and you're in the moment with your God. And I
Yep.
love that. I love that.
Yep.
And,
Yep.
and of course, the claiming space thing for our people. I was, and I follow my body, like I follow my body. And Charmaine William Larson and I were riding through Alabama. And I don't know what came over me. All of a sudden, I started screaming, and nobody was around, just me and her flying along, you know. And all of a sudden, my body was yelling, and I was screaming, and I was like, "This is our land! I take it back!" I was just like fucking yelling my head off for about a half an hour. I couldn't stop. Like I couldn't. I was like, "Oh my God, you're crazy!" But it was like, so it's such a powerful reclamation of
Mm-hmm.
our indigenousness on our land, you know. And
Absolutely.
so that's, I think I just wanted to end with kind of wrap it up, and then I wanted you to make some closing comments. Like, you know, earlier I wrote down that you said, you know, we're a hot potato, you know, like we're a legal hot potato because this is our land. That's
Mm-hmm.
why we're a legal hot potato, you know,
Mm-hmm.
because
Absolutely.
acknowledging us properly is going to cost this country money, because like you
Mm-hmm.
said, money is the way that things happen. So that it's not me who created the money system, you know, but our
Mm-hmm.
land. And I don't mean any disrespect at all, you know, but $5 and some lard is not a good deal, you know. I'm
Mm-hmm.
sorry, it's not. And sugar, now we're all dying, you know, of too much fat and too much sugar.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's because of the land. They don't know what to do because they have to acknowledge that this is our land.
Mm-hmm.
That's going to cost them money.
Yeah.
And Canadians are all, I wrote an article recently where they're like willfully blind. They're all like ostriches with, they're just like, "Oh, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do." I'm like, "Oh my God, wake up is the first thing you should do. You know,
Mm-hmm.
educate yourself and get to know an Indian, you know, make a
Mm-hmm.
friend or two."
Yep. Yeah, absolutely.
I got all wrapped up. What are your closing comments there, Chief?
Well, you covered a lot there, Joan. Like when you started out riding and, you know, being in Winnipeg and, you know, what really resonated with me was, you know, being subjected to violence as a young Indigenous woman on the streets of Winnipeg.
Yeah.
You know, and I don't know when that happened, but that happened, you know, and that's still happening today. It's happened in my family.
Yeah.
I'll tell you right now, I've always struggled in the conversation that we have around missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, two spirits, missing and murdered Indigenous men. Um, I've struggled in there because I have my own trauma from my own family's loss when I was a little boy. You know,
Yeah.
the cities are very violent places still. Um, the violence takes different shapes. Sometimes it's not as abrupt as, you know, a woman walking up to a young girl and slapping her down because she's Indigenous. It manifests in different ways. You know, I'm dealing with that right now, you know, in another city with one of our members where, you know, there's a non-Indigenous board that's taken over an Indigenous organization, and they're trying to push the Indigenous perspective and the Indigenous lens out of the process. And on the surface of it, you know, it looks all legitimate, but really it's taking away and robbing our space that we had claimed as Indigenous people, and it's happening. That's violence too. You know,
Totally.
when a board says, "Oh, we don't want elders here anymore," that's violence. You know, and um, it's a conversation that needs to continue. You know, I think it's a conversation that has to include Indigenous men as well, because we're hurting too. Like
Yeah.
we're not trying to be involved for any political gain or for any political agenda. We're also part of the healing that has to come
Mm,
from the willingness to
absolutely.
have these conversations. So I appreciate you raising that. And you know, I remember the years of riding with you, you know, our first Treaty Freedom ride. And it'll always be burned in my brain, you know, driving down the highway and looking in my rearview mirror, and there's Joan. It was as consistent for days and days on end. You're right there in my rearview mirror. and being part of that, and undertaking the challenge, and being there step in step with everybody else. It really added to the enrichment of the experience, and I'm so appreciative of that. I'll be appreciative of that my whole life, and when I'm riding down to Wounded Knee this year, I'm going to be thinking about you, thinking, geez, it would have been nice to have Joan here with us again to make this trip, so. But life's about trade-offs, and I recognize you're making your priorities known, and I respect that, so I think those are my comments, and I really appreciate the time you've given me. I hope that your listeners have kind ears when they listen in to what I have to say. So.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much. And I'm gonna close when I stop the live feed. Yeah, we'll just say goodbye to each other privately, because we'll still be on like we were before we started.
Okay.
And I decided long ago, I love laughing. You know that, Derek. I'm half crazy. So I decided that Brave Indigenous Conversations with Joan Jack is primarily all about the earrings. So these so I decided that every part I have an earring addiction, bad earring addiction, beaded earring, silver earrings. Yeah, as long as they're indigenous, I'm so addicted. So these earrings are a very simple design, and I decided to feature. I'm justifying my addiction here. You see, I decided to feature a woman's art, and I have a couple of pair from men, but not many. Every session. So these were made by Donna Jim. And you can find her on Facebook, Donna Jim, and she's a beginning beater. And although this is a very simple beginning design, I love her color choice, and they're so graceful and elegant. And I think we should support our beginning artists. I like the like the streak of gold that she put all the way through the middle, that you really got to look at it to see them. So I'm wearing Donna Jim's today. Her mother also, Pamela Jim, does beautiful moccasins and beading and stuff. And I think Pam has her own website now. So yeah.
Very nice.
Very nice. Yeah. So I think we're good. Miigwech.
All right. Miigwech.